Waiter discriminates against Post Malone in hotel. The ending was epic. Drummed against the windows of the Grand Plaza Hotel, creating a soothing rhythm that almost made Post Malone forget how exhausted he was. Almost. 3 shows, in 3 different cities over the past 4 days, had left him running on empty. His throat was raw, his muscles ached, and all he wanted was a quiet dinner before crashing in his hotel room. "You sure you don't want room service, boss?" Steve, his head of security, asked as they walked through the hotel's marble-floored lobby. "We could have something sent up." Post shook his head, running a hand through his messy hair. "Nah, man. Been eating in hotel rooms all week. Need to sit somewhere that isn't a bus or a dressing room, you know?" "At least let me call ahead to the restaurant," Steve offered, already reaching for his phone. Post waved him off. "Just a normal dinner, Steve. No calls, no VIP treatment. Just normal." He managed a tired smile. "Besides, place probably isn't even busy on a Tuesday night." Steve nodded reluctantly, falling into step behind his client. After 6 years of working for Austin Post, known to the world as Post Malone, he knew better than to push too hard. Despite all his success, Post remained surprisingly down to earth, often preferring to handle things himself rather than pull the celebrity card. The hotel's restaurant, La Maison, sat just off the main lobby. Through its glass doors, Post could see white tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, and well-dressed patrons engaging in quiet conversation. He glanced down at his own outfit, a vintage Wu-Tang Clan t-shirt, basketball shorts, and hotel slippers, and chuckled. "Maybe I should have changed," he muttered, more to himself than to Steve. A young woman walking past did a double take, her eyes widening in recognition. "Oh my God," she whispered, fumbling for her phone. "Are you—" "Sorry, miss." Steve stepped in smoothly. "No photos right now. Artist is off duty." The woman looked disappointed but nodded understanding. "My daughter loves your music," she said to Post. "Especially Circles. We danced to it in the kitchen." Post's tired face lit up with a genuine smile. "That's awesome. What's her name?" "Sarah. She's 8. Post dug in his pocket and pulled out a hotel notepad he'd grabbed earlier. He quickly scribbled a note and signed it. "Here, tell Sarah to keep dancing." The woman's eyes welled up as she took the autograph. "Thank you. You didn't have to." "Nah, thank you," Post interrupted. "Makes it all worth it hearing stuff like that." As the woman walked away clutching the autograph, Steve smiled. "And that's why I've stuck around 6 years." Post laughed, thought it was the dental plan. He pushed open the restaurant doors, the soft sounds of classical music washing over them. The maitre d', a tall man in his 50s with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his reservation book. His pleasant, professional expression flickered for just a moment as he took in Post's appearance. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, sorry," Post replied. "Just hoping to grab some dinner if you've got space." The maitre d', his name tag read Richard, made a show of consulting his book. "Ah, well, we are quite busy tonight." He gestured at the dining room, where at least half the tables stood empty. Steve cleared his throat. "Sir, if you just—" Post cut him off with a look. "We can wait at the bar if that's easier," he offered. Richard's lips thinned. Perhaps, yes, the bar might be more suitable. As they followed Richard through the dining room, Post could feel the stares. It wasn't the usual recognition he got at shows or on the street. These were different, judgmental, dismissive. A woman in an expensive-looking dress whispered something to her companion, both of them snickering behind their menus. The bar area was darker than the main dining room, tucked away in a corner. A few businessmen sat nursing drinks, barely looking up as Richard directed Post and Steve to a pair of bar stools. "Tom will be your server this evening," Richard said, placing 2 menus on the bar. "He'll be with you. Eventually." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Post and Steve alone in the bar's dim lighting. "Boss," Steve said quietly, "just say the word, and we'll go somewhere else. Or I can have a word with the manager." Post picked up one of the menus, pretending to study it intently. "Nah, it's fine. Nothing I haven't dealt with before." He tried to keep his voice light, but Steve could hear the hurt underneath. "Besides, I'm too tired to go looking for another place." The bartender, a young man with carefully styled hair, was pointedly ignoring them while wiping down already clean glasses. Post could see him sneaking glances, clearly trying to figure out if he recognized him or not. Several minutes passed. The businessmen at the other end of the bar received their drinks and appetizers. A couple was seated at a table near the windows, immediately attended to by a waiter. Still, no one came to take their order. "Water would be nice," Post said, loud enough for the bartender to hear. The young man jumped slightly, then hurried over. "Sorry about the wait," he mumbled, filling 2 water glasses. "Tom's, busy with other tables." "No worries," Post replied, offering a smile. The bartender didn't return it. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, their server appeared. Tom was tall and thin, with perfectly pressed black slacks and a crisp white shirt. His name tag was positioned exactly parallel to the floor. Everything about him screamed precision and professionalism, except for the barely concealed look of distaste on his face. "Good evening," he said, his voice dripping with forced politeness. "I understand you'll be dining with us at the bar tonight?" "That's the plan," Post replied cheerfully, determined to maintain his composure. "Pretty hungry after." "We do have a dress code here at La Maison," Tom interrupted, his eyes pointedly scanning Post's casual attire. "Though I suppose exceptions can be made for certain guests." Steve shifted in his seat, but Post placed a calming hand on his arm. "Thank you for making an exception then," he said quietly. "Could we start with some appetizers?" Tom's lip curled slightly. "Of course. Though you might want to review the prices first. Our clientele tends to be well prepared for our premium pricing." A couple seated nearby looked over, clearly listening to the exchange. The woman's eyes widened as she finally recognized Post, and she quickly elbowed her companion. "I think we'll manage," Post replied, his voice still steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. "Could we get the charcuterie board and some calamari?" Tom wrote nothing down. "The calamari is prepared in a very sophisticated manner, not your typical bar food." "Sounds perfect." "And to drink?" "We have an extensive wine list, though perhaps you'd prefer something more casual? A beer, perhaps?" Each word was like a small paper cut. Tiny, precise wounds designed to make Post feel as unwelcome as possible. He could feel his hands wanting to shake, the same way they used to before he'd made it, when people would judge him by his tattoos and assume the worst. "Actually," Post said, "I'd love to see that wine list." Tom's eyebrows rose fractionally. "As you wish." He walked away without another word, leaving the wine list untouched on the bar. Steve waited until Tom was out of earshot before speaking. "Boss, this is bullshit. Let me call the manager." Post took a long drink of water, using the moment to compose himself. "Not yet. Maybe he's just having a bad day." "Bad day, my ass," Steve muttered. "He's being a prejudiced." "Language," Post teased, trying to lighten the mood. "We're in a fancy establishment." But Steve wasn't smiling. "I've watched you play for presidents and royalty. You've got more class in your pinky than this whole place. You shouldn't have to deal with this crap." Post stared into his water glass, watching the ice cubes slowly melt. "You know what the weird thing is? Even after everything, the albums, the tours, the Grammy nominations, sometimes I still feel like that kid from Syracuse who everybody wrote off. Like maybe they were right about me." "Boss." I know. Post managed a small smile. "Just tired, I guess. Makes the old insecurities pop up." The next hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of subtle insults and deliberate slights. Their appetizers arrived cold, long after other diners who had ordered after them received their food. Tom forgot their drink orders twice, then brought Post the cheapest beer on the menu instead of the wine he'd requested. Each interaction was wrapped in a thin veneer of professional service, making it impossible to point to any single moment as obviously discriminatory. More diners had filled the restaurant, and Post could feel the stares and whispers. Some had recognized him now, phones discreetly pointed in his direction. He kept his head down, picking at his cold calamari, trying to ignore the growing tension in his shoulders. A young busboy, his name tag read Mike, kept passing by their section, clearing tables with quick, efficient movements. Unlike Tom, he offered Post genuine smiles when their eyes met. Once, Post heard him humming circles under his breath as he stacked dirty plates. "At least somebody here has good taste in music," Post joked quietly to Steve. The breaking point came as Tom approached with their main courses. His shoe caught on nothing, and suddenly red wine was cascading across the bar, splashing across Post's white t-shirt. "Oh dear," Tom said, not even attempting to sound sincere. "How clumsy of me. Though perhaps this isn't the best venue for casual wear." The restaurant had gone quiet. All eyes were on their corner of the bar. Post could feel his chest tightening, years of insecurities and judgments threatening to overwhelm him. But he forced himself to take a deep breath, then another. Steve was halfway out of his seat, but Post's quiet voice stopped him. "It's okay, Steve. Accidents happen." "Boss, enough is enough. This isn't... Please." Post's voice was barely a whisper. "Just let me handle this my way." Tom stood there, empty wine glass in hand, clearly waiting for, maybe even hoping for, an explosion. Post could feel the weight of the moment, could sense the phone's recording, waiting to capture whatever happened next. One angry outburst, and tomorrow's headlines would read, "Post Malone melts down in luxury restaurant." Instead, Post slowly stood up, wine dripping from his ruined shirt. He looked Tom directly in the eyes and said something that would change the entire course of the evening. "Could I speak to your manager, please? I'd like to tell them what an interesting experience dining here has been." Tom's smirk faltered, just slightly, as he realized this situation might not play out quite the way he'd expected. "Of course, sir," Tom replied, his voice tight. "I'll fetch them right away." He turned sharply on his heel, disappearing into the kitchen. The young busboy, Mike, rushed over with a handful of clean napkins. "I'm so sorry about this," he whispered, handing them to Post. "Tom shouldn't. I mean, he's been—" "It's okay, kid," Post said softly, dabbing at his shirt. "Not your fault." Mike glanced around nervously, then leaned in closer. "Congratulations got me through some rough times in high school. Just wanted you to know that." Post's face softened into a genuine smile. "Thanks, man, that means a lot." Steve was still seething, his security training warring with his personal desire to handle the situation more directly. "Boss, let me call corporate. This kind of treatment—" "Let's see what the manager has to say first," Post interrupted, still trying to salvage his shirt. The wine had soaked through completely, the white fabric now stained a mottled pink. He could hear phones clicking away, knew this would probably end up on social media within minutes. A well-dressed couple at a nearby table had been watching the scene unfold. The woman stood up suddenly, grabbing her designer handbag. "Harold, we're leaving," she announced loudly. "I won't spend money at an establishment that treats anyone this way, celebrity or not." She turned to Post. "My daughter made me learn all your songs during lockdown. You didn't deserve any of this." Her husband, already pulling out his wallet, nodded in agreement. "Disgraceful behavior." Other diners began to murmur, the mood in the restaurant shifting. What had started as judgmental stares were turning into looks of sympathy and anger on Post's behalf. A group of young businessmen at the bar, who had initially kept their distance, now moved closer, forming a subtle but supportive barrier around him. "Yo, man," one of them said, "my wife and I had our first dance to Circles. You really gonna let them treat you like this?" Post shrugged, still dabbing at his shirt. "Sometimes people just need a chance to realize they got things wrong, you know?" The main dining room had erupted into a low buzz of conversation. More people were standing up, some asking for their checks, others pulling out phones to document what was happening. The maitre d', Richard, was frantically moving from table to table, trying to calm the situation. Through the kitchen doors, Post could see Tom engaged in an intense conversation with an older woman in a crisp black blazer. Her face grew increasingly concerned as Tom gestured animatedly. Mike had lingered nearby, ostensibly cleaning the bar but clearly monitoring the situation. "That's Mrs. Chen," he said quietly. "She's the restaurant manager. She's actually really nice. I don't know why she lets Tom get away with." Before he could finish, the kitchen doors swung open. Mrs. Chen strode out, her face a professional mask of concern. Tom trailed behind her, his earlier confidence notably diminished. "Sir," Mrs. Chen began. "I understand there's been an incident." Post looked down at his ruined shirt, then back at her with a tired smile. "You could say that." "Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private," she suggested, gesturing toward a door marked "Private Dining Room." Steve stepped forward. "Whatever you have to say can be said right here." The restaurant had gone completely quiet. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Post could feel the weight of their attention, the same way he felt it before stepping onto stage. But this wasn't a performance. This was about something more important. Actually, Post said, his voice carrying in the silence, I think right here is perfect. Because what happened tonight isn't just about me. The private dining room felt colder than the rest of the restaurant. Post sat at the head of a long mahogany table, his wine-stained shirt now dry but stiff and uncomfortable against his skin. Mrs. Chen had insisted on moving their discussion here, away from the prying eyes and recording phones of other diners. Mr. Post, she began, clasping her hands on the table, I want to assure you that La Maison takes customer service very seriously. Austin, he interrupted quietly. Just call me Austin. She blinked, thrown off script. Yes, well, Austin. Tom has explained that there was an unfortunate accident with the wine. Mrs. Chen, Steve cut in from his position by the door. With all due respect, what happened out there wasn't an accident. We both know that. Tom stood in the corner, his earlier smugness replaced by a nervous energy. His fingers kept fidgeting with his perfectly pressed collar, pulling it slightly askew. I would never intentionally. Tom started, but Post raised his hand. Let's just start over, okay? Clean slate. I'm still hungry, and I'm sure you've got other customers to take care of. Mrs. Chen's relief was palpable. Yes, of course. I'll have the kitchen prepare your orders again immediately. Tom, please. I'll take care of Mr. Post personally, Tom said quickly, already moving toward the door. Post watched him go, then turned to Mrs. Chen. Actually, could we get a different server? No offense, but I think Tom and I got off on the wrong foot. Of course. Of course. She stood up, smoothing her blazer. I'll send Jackson right away. He's one of our most experienced. What about Mike? Post suggested. The busboy? He seems like he knows what he's doing. Mrs. Chen hesitated. Mike is still in training. He's not authorized to handle tables in the main dining room yet. Perfect time to start, isn't it? After a few more minutes of discussion, they returned to the main dining room. Many of the earlier diners had left, but news of Post's presence had spread, and new customers were arriving, trying to look casual as they scanned the room for him. Mike appeared at their new table, a good one this time, by the windows, with fresh menus and a nervous smile. Good evening, sir. I've never actually done this before, so if I mess up, you'll do fine, Post assured him. And seriously, call me Austin. The next hour started peacefully enough. Mike was inexperienced but eager to please, and the kitchen seemed to be expediting their orders. Post could feel himself starting to relax, the tension from earlier beginning to fade. Then Tom reappeared. He wasn't serving their table anymore, but he kept finding reasons to pass by. Each time, he'd make a point of checking on the tables around them, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. Is everything to your satisfaction, sir? He'd ask other diners. We pride ourselves on maintaining certain standards here. Or, I'm so pleased you dressed appropriately for the evening, madam. It shows such respect for our establishment. Mike noticed too. His hands shook slightly as he refilled Post's water glass. I'm sorry about him, he whispered. He's always like this when he thinks someone doesn't belong. Don't worry about it, Post replied, but his appetite was fading. The warmth that had started to return to the evening was seeping away, replaced by that familiar cold feeling in his chest. A group of business executives at the next table were celebrating some kind of deal. Their laughter and conversation had been getting progressively louder as they ordered more bottles of wine. Tom was attending to them personally, his service impeccable and fawning. Another bottle of the Bordeaux, gentlemen? He suggested smoothly, although he glanced meaningfully at Post's table. We do have some lovely domestic options if you prefer something less sophisticated. One of the executives frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Oh, nothing at all, Tom replied with a thin smile. Just trying to accommodate all tastes. Post stared down at his plate, pushing food around with his fork. His hands were trembling slightly now, memories flooding back unbidden. High school counselors telling him he'd never amount to anything. Record executives dismissing him because of his looks. Years of people taking one look at his tattoos and making assumptions. Steve noticed the change in his demeanor. Boss, we can go. Just say the word. No, Post said quietly. Running away just proves them right. Mike arrived with their dessert menus, almost dropping them as he tried to avoid colliding with Tom, who had suddenly stepped into his path. Careful there, Tom said loudly. We wouldn't want another accident, though some of our guests might not notice the difference between clean and stained attire. The executives at the next table had gone quiet, listening to the exchange. One of them, a woman in a sharp business suit, turned in her chair. Excuse me, she called to Tom. Could you explain exactly what you mean by that? Tom's smile didn't waver. Just maintaining our standards, madam. Though I suppose some people might find that concept challenging to understand. Really? The woman's voice was steel, wrapped in silk. Because from where I'm sitting, the only challenging thing to understand is how someone so clearly lacking in basic human decency managed to get hired at what's supposed to be a premium establishment. Tom's face flushed. I assure you, madam, I'm not finished. She cut him off. I've been sitting here watching you try to humiliate someone who's shown more class in the last hour than you have in your entire shift. Do you even know who he is? I don't see how that's relevant. It's not, Post interrupted softly. Who I am shouldn't matter. Nobody deserves to be treated this way. The woman turned to him, her expression softening. No, they don't. Which is why I'll be speaking to the hotel management about this tomorrow. I'm on the board of directors. Tom's face went from red to white. I was simply being a bully, she finished for him, and not even a very subtle one. Other diners were watching now, phones discreetly recording the exchange. Tom stood frozen, his perfect posture crumbling slightly. He started, then stopped. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Shame, maybe, or fear. Then his expression hardened again. Well, he said, his voice dripping with forced politeness. I suppose some people are simply more comfortable in certain environments. Perhaps Denny's would be more suitable. The words hung in the air like poison. Post felt them hit like physical blows, each one reinforcing every doubt, every insecurity he'd ever felt. His vision blurred slightly, and he gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. Steve started to rise, but Post caught his arm. Don't, he said quietly. Please. The woman from the next table had stood up now, her dinner companions following suit. We'll be leaving, she announced, and I suggest everyone else do the same. I wouldn't want to spend another $1 in an establishment that allows this kind of behavior. Other diners began to push back their chairs. The sound of bills being requested and credit cards being pulled out filled the air. Tom stood in the middle of it all, his carefully maintained facade finally starting to crack. Mrs. Chen burst out of the kitchen, having apparently been informed of the situation. Please, everyone, there's no need to. Actually, Post said, his voice carrying despite its softness. I think there is. He stood up slowly, the wine-stained shirt, a badge of everything that had happened. But before anyone leaves, there's something that needs to be said. The room went still, all eyes turning to him. In that moment, he wasn't Post Malone the celebrity. He was just a person who'd been pushed too far, standing up not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel less than worthy. Tom took an involuntary step backward, perhaps finally realizing just how badly he'd misjudged the situation. But what happened next would change everything, not just for that evening, but for both men's lives going forward. Tom, Post said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Can we talk? Just you and me? The request hung in the air, unexpected and heavy with possibility. Mrs. Chen quickly stepped forward. Perhaps my office would be more appropriate for. Right here is fine, Post said quietly. If Tom's okay with that? Tom's perfectly maintained facade was crumbling by the second. His collar had come completely undone, and a slight sheen of sweat was visible on his forehead. I don't. Just a conversation, Post assured him. That's all. The woman from the executive table hadn't left yet. She was watching the scene unfold with intense interest, her phone forgotten in her hand. Around the restaurant, other diners sat in tense silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Mike hovered nearby, nervously stacking and restacking clean plates. Post noticed and gave him a small nod of reassurance. Look, Post continued, his voice low enough that people had to lean in to hear. I get it. I walk in here looking like this, he gestured to his tattooed arms and casual clothes. And you see someone who doesn't belong, someone who's gonna mess up your perfect evening. Maybe cost you some tips from your regular customers. Tom's hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted his name tag for the 100th time. You don't understand. There are standards here, expectations. I have to maintain. A certain image? Post finished for him. Yeah, I know something about that. People took one look at me and decided who I was, what I was worth. Teachers, record labels, everyone had me figured out before I said a word. Something flickered in Tom's eyes. Recognition, maybe. His perfectly rigid posture softened just slightly. It's not personal, he said, but his voice had lost its sharp edge. This job is all I have. If I don't maintain the proper atmosphere, if I don't keep things exactly right, you might lose everything, Post suggested gently. End up being judged the way you've been judging others? The silence in the restaurant was absolute now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped what they were doing, watching through the service window. Tom's face was a battlefield of emotions, anger warring with shame, fear fighting against the realization of what he'd been doing. His hands moved to his collar again, but this time instead of straightening it, he loosened it slightly. He started, then stopped, swallowed hard. My father was a waiter, worked his whole life in places like this. Told me the only way to succeed was to be perfect, to never let anyone see weakness, to keep out people who didn't belong. And who gets to decide who belongs? Post asked softly. Before Tom could answer, a commotion at the restaurant entrance drew everyone's attention. A group of young people had gathered outside the glass doors, phones raised, trying to get pictures. Word had gotten out that Post Malone was there. Oh God, Tom whispered, panic crossing his face. The manager from corporate is coming tonight. If she sees this crowd, if she thinks I caused a scene. Post saw real fear in the other man's eyes. For all his earlier cruelty, Tom suddenly looked very young and very scared. Steve moved toward the doors, already in security mode. I'll handle the crowd, boss. But Post raised his hand. Wait, Tom, what time is this manager coming? 9:30, Tom replied automatically, then checked his watch and went even paler. In 20 minutes. Post nodded slowly. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Mike's hands were shaking as he pushed through the kitchen doors, nearly colliding with a stack of clean plates. The kitchen was a chaos of sizzling pans and shouted orders, but he barely noticed. His phone felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. Watch it, kid, Jorge, the head chef, called out as Mike stumbled past. What's got you so worked up? I need to find Mrs. Chen, Mike stammered. It's important. Like, really important. She's in her office, Jorge said, expertly flipping a steak. But you better have a good reason. She's on the phone with corporate about all the commotion out there. Mike nodded, already heading for the back office. His mind was racing, replaying everything he'd witnessed in the dining room. The way Tom had treated Post Malone, the wine accident, the subtle but constant stream of insults. And now he had proof of something that could change everything. He found Mrs. Chen at her desk, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, I understand the severity. No, we're handling the situation. Of course, customer satisfaction is our top priority. Mike shifted from foot to foot, waiting for her to notice him. Through the office window, he could see into the dining room where Post still sat at his table, maintaining his composure despite everything that had happened. I'll call you back, Mrs. Chen said finally, hanging up. She looked exhausted. Mike, unless the kitchen's on fire. You need to see this, Mike blurted out, pulling out his phone. His fingers trembled as he pulled up the video he'd been watching earlier that day. It's about him, about Post Malone. Mrs. Chen sighed. Mike, we're in the middle of a crisis. I don't have time for. Please, Mike insisted, an urgency in his voice she'd never heard before. This is important. This is about who he really is. Something in his tone made her pause. All right, show me. Mike's phone screen flickered to life, showing a news clip from just a few months ago. The headline read, Music Star's Secret Campaign of Kindness Revealed. The video showed Post Malone in a series of clips, quietly paying off student lunch debts at several schools, buying groceries for struggling families during the pandemic, setting up scholarship funds for underprivileged kids, In one segment, he was interviewed leaving a restaurant where he'd just left a $1,000 tip. "Why do this without publicity?" the reporter asked. Post's response was simple. "Because helping people isn't about getting credit, it's about doing what's right." Mike swiped to another video, this one from a fan's social media. It showed Post stopping his concert when he spotted a young fan having a panic attack. He'd halted everything, made sure the kid got medical attention, and then paid for their hospital bill afterward. "There's more," Mike said, his voice growing stronger. "So much more. He's been doing this stuff for years, but he never talks about it, never brags. And tonight, Tom treated him like..." Mrs. Chen's professional mask cracked slightly. "Oh dear," she whispered. "That's not all," Mike continued, pulling up more videos. During COVID, when restaurants were struggling, he set up a fund for service workers, gave away hundreds of thousands of dollars to help people keep their homes, feed their families. Some of them worked in places just like this. Each new video seemed to hit Mrs. Chen like a physical blow. The composed restaurant manager looked increasingly distressed as she watched the evidence of who they'd been mistreating. "And you know what's crazy?" Mike added. "He's sitting out there right now, still being polite, still treating everyone with respect. Even Tom, even after everything." Through the window, they could see Tom hovering near Post's table, still making his snide comments, still trying to make Post feel unwelcome. The contrast between the man they'd been watching in the videos and how he was being treated was stark. "I have to fix this," Mrs. Chen said, standing up suddenly. "I have to." "Wait," Mike said, surprising himself with his boldness. "There's something else you should see first." He pulled up one final video. It was from a small diner in Texas where Post had stopped during a tour. The waitress, an older woman with gray hair, was interviewed afterward. "He came in wearing regular clothes, all tattooed up," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Some of our regular customers started making comments, tried to make him feel unwelcome. But he just smiled, treated everyone with kindness. Then I found out later he'd paid off my grandson's medical bills, said he'd overheard me talking about it with another waitress. That's the kind of person he is." Mrs. Chen sank back into her chair. "And Tom has been, making the same judgments," Mike finished, "the same assumptions. But look at him out there, he's still not fighting back, still not getting angry, he's just taking it, like maybe he's used to it." Through the office window, they watched as Post smiled at a young server who'd nervously asked for an autograph. Despite his wine-stained shirt, despite Tom's continued harassment, he took the time to write a personal message and ask about her day. "He's not just a customer," Mike said quietly. "He's exactly the kind of person we should want in here. Not because he's famous, but because of who he is." Mrs. Chen stood up again, straightening her blazer with determined movements. "Stay here," she ordered. "I need to handle this personally." "Mrs. Chen?" Mike called as she reached the door. "There's something else you should know. About Tom." He pulled up one final article on his phone, this one from 6 months ago. It was about restaurant workers struggling with mental health issues, featuring anonymous interviews. One of them was clearly Tom, though his name wasn't used. "I put on this perfect facade," Mike read aloud, "because I'm terrified of being judged the way I judge others. Every shift is like armor I put on, but underneath I'm just scared." Mrs. Chen's hand froze on the doorknob. "How did you find this?" "I recognized the details he shared," Mike said. "About his father being a waiter. About the pressure to be perfect. He doesn't know I know, but maybe this isn't just about tonight. Maybe it's about something bigger." Through the window, they could see Post standing up, his patience finally seeming to wear thin. The dining room had gone quiet, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. "Well," Mrs. Chen said, squaring her shoulders, "I suppose it's time to find out exactly what kind of restaurant we want to be." As she pushed open the office door, Mike's phone buzzed with a notification. Another video of Post's kindness had gone viral. The contrast between that Post Malone and the one sitting in their restaurant with a wine-stained shirt, being treated like he was somehow less than human, couldn't have been clearer. The truth was out now. The question was, what would they do with it? Mrs. Chen strode into the dining room with Mike trailing behind her. The tension in the air was palpable. Several diners had their phones out, not even trying to be discreet anymore. This was the kind of moment that could go viral in minutes. "Mrs. Chen," Tom said quickly, intercepting her. "I can explain?" "Not now, Tom." She cut him off, her voice firm but not unkind. She'd seen something in that article Mike showed her, something that made Tom's behavior tonight make a twisted kind of sense. But that would have to wait. Post was still standing by his table, Steve a protective shadow behind him. The wine stain on his shirt had dried into an ugly burgundy pattern, but somehow he managed to maintain an air of dignity that had nothing to do with clothes or appearance. "Mr. Post," Mrs. Chen began, "I need to." "Austin," he corrected gently, just as he had earlier. Still, just Austin. The humility in his voice, after everything they'd put him through, made her pause. Mike had been right. The contrast between who they'd assumed he was and who he actually was couldn't have been starker. "I've just been shown some things," she continued carefully, "about your work during the pandemic, about your support of service industry workers, about your—" "My PR team does a good job," Post interrupted with a small shrug. "But that's not what tonight is about." "No," Mrs. Chen agreed. "Tonight is about how we failed, how I failed. As a manager, as a person, I should have." "Excuse me," a new voice cut in. Everyone turned to see an elderly couple making their way toward them. The woman was clutching her phone, tears in her eyes. "I just got off the phone with my daughter," she said, her voice trembling. "She worked at a restaurant in Dallas. During COVID, when they had to close, she was going to lose her apartment. Then someone anonymously paid 6 months of rent for all the staff." She looked at Post, who shifted uncomfortably. "That was you, wasn't it?" Post rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "A lot of people helped out during that time," he deflected. "She has a little girl," the woman pressed on. 7 years old. They would have been homeless." The dining room had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working, everyone watching the scene unfold. Tom stood frozen, his earlier superiority replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. "I was fortunate," Post said quietly. "Had some success, made some money. Seemed wrong not to help when people were struggling. But that's exactly what this is about, Mrs. Chen interrupted. "Because while you were quietly helping people in our industry, I let you be treated like you didn't belong here." She turned to address the whole restaurant. "This establishment was founded on the principle of excellence. Somewhere along the way, we confused excellence with exclusivity. We started judging people by their clothes, their appearances, their conformity to what we thought our customers should look like." Tom's hands were shaking as he adjusted his name tag again. Mike noticed he'd put it on upside down after his last adjustment. "Mrs. Chen," Tom started. "The corporate review can wait," she said firmly. "Some things are more important than corporate reviews." The elderly woman was still standing there, tears now flowing freely. "My granddaughter falls asleep every night listening to your music," she told Post. "She says it makes her feel less alone." Post's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. He blinked hard, and Steve shifted closer, protective as always. "Thank you for telling me that," Post said softly. "It means a lot." More people were standing up now, moving closer. Not with phones raised for pictures, but with stories to share. A young man in a business suit talked about how Post's music helped him through depression. A waitress mentioned her brother who got a scholarship from Post's foundation. Each story seemed to hit Tom like a physical blow, the reality of who he'd been tormenting becoming clearer with each word. Mike watched it all, still clutching his phone with its videos and articles. He saw the moment Tom's perfect posture finally collapsed completely, saw the mask of superiority crumble away to reveal something raw and real underneath. Tom's voice cracked. He looked at Post, really looked at him, maybe for the first time. "I didn't know. I didn't." "No," Post agreed quietly. "You didn't. But that's kind of the point, isn't it?" Mrs. Chen took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Mr. Post, Austin, I know no apology can fully address what happened here tonight. But if you're willing, I'd like to." "Actually," Post interrupted, his voice gentle but firm, "I'd like to talk to Tom. Just Tom, if that's okay." The private dining room felt different now. The earlier coldness had been replaced by something else. Anticipation, possibility, maybe even hope. Post sat at one end of the mahogany table, his wine-stained shirt now completely dry, a testament to everything that had led to this moment. Tom sat at the other end, his perfect posture gone, name tag still upside down. "You don't have to do this," Steve said quietly to Post. "After what he did." "I do, though," Post replied, "because maybe this isn't just about tonight." Mrs. Chen had insisted on staying, but Post gently asked for privacy. Now it was just the two of them, the musician who'd been judged and the waiter who'd done the judging. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Through the door they could hear the muffled sounds of the restaurant, plates clinking, quiet conversations, life going on. "Why?" Tom finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why even talk to me? You could have me fired, could probably sue the restaurant, could destroy my whole—" "Is that what you'd do?" Post interrupted. "If our positions were reversed?" Tom's hands, which had been fidgeting with his collar, went still. I don't know anymore." "Sure you do," Post said quietly. "You already showed exactly what you do. From the moment I walked in, you made judgments, assumptions, decided who I was before I said a word." "I'm sorry," Tom blurted out. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but why'd you do it?" The question hung in the air. Tom opened his mouth, closed it again, his eyes darted to the door like he was looking for escape. "The truth," Post added. "Not what you think I want to hear. Not what sounds good. The truth." Tom's breath came out in a shaky exhale. Because you scared me." That wasn't what Post had expected. "Scared you?" "Not physically," Tom clarified quickly. God, this sounds stupid, but you walked in here looking however you wanted to look, being whoever you wanted to be. No pretense. Number armor." "Armor?" Tom gestured at his uniform, his perfectly pressed pants, his polished shoes. "All of this, it's armor. Every shift, I put it on. Make sure everything's perfect. Because if it's perfect, if I'm perfect, then maybe." "Maybe what?" "Maybe I'll finally belong here." The words came out in a rush, like they'd been waiting years to be spoken. "My father was a waiter, worked his whole life in places like this. Never quite fit in, never quite made it to the top positions. He always told me, you have to be better, have to be perfect, can't let them see any weakness." Post nodded slowly. "And how's that working out?" A bitter laugh escaped Tom. "Look at me. I'm so busy trying to prove I belong that I turned into everything I used to hate, everything that used to hurt me." "Been there," Post said quietly. Tom looked up sharply. "You? But you're what? Successful? Famous?" Post shook his head. "Man, you should have seen the looks I got when I first started in music. The things people said. Every tattoo was another reason they said I wouldn't make it. Every time I didn't fit their image of what a musician should be." "How did you deal with it?" "Figured out something important." Post leaned forward. "The people who judge you for not fitting their mold, they're not the ones you want to impress anyway." Tears were forming in Tom's eyes now. He tried to blink them away, but they fell anyway, leaving tracks down his carefully composed face. "I'm so tired," he whispered. "So tired of being perfect. Of judging and being judged. Of being afraid all the time." "Yeah," Post said softly. "That's exhausting. Trust me, I know. I can't believe I did this, after everything you've done for people in the service industry for." "Hey." Post's voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't about that. Not about my music or charity work or any of that. This is about two people who both know what it feels like to be judged, to be told they don't belong." Tom wiped his eyes with his perfectly pressed sleeve, not caring anymore about keeping up appearances. "Why are you being so kind to me? After what I did?" "Because someone has to break the cycle," Post replied simply. "Someone has to be the one to say, this stops here." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mike poked his head in nervously. "Sorry, but the corporate manager is here. She's asking for Tom." The color drained from Tom's face. "Oh God. This is it. I'll be fired. I'll lose everything. My father will." "Actually," Post said, standing up, "I think I'd like to talk to this manager too. If that's okay?" 20 minutes later, the main dining room was buzzing with conversation. The corporate manager, a stern-looking woman named Miss Harrison, sat at a table with Post, Tom, and Mrs. Chen. Her initial anger had transformed into something else, as she listened to Post explain not just what had happened, but what he thought they could learn from it. "So, you don't want him fired?" Miss Harrison asked, clearly confused. "I want something better," Post replied. "I want change, real change." Over the next hour, plans were made. The restaurant would implement new training programs, focusing on unconscious bias and genuine hospitality. Tom, surprisingly, volunteered to help develop them, sharing his own story as an example of how prejudice can come from unexpected places. "My father always said appearance was everything in this business," Tom told the group, his voice stronger now. "But maybe he was wrong. Maybe what matters is how we make people feel, not how they look." The corporate manager was taking notes furiously. "This could be implemented across all our properties," she mused. "A complete redesign of our service philosophy." Post smiled. "Sometimes the best changes come from the hardest moments." As the meeting wound down, Tom turned to Post. "I still don't understand. You could have ruined me. Instead, you helped me. Why?" "Because," Post said, "sometimes the person acting the meanest is the one hurting the most, and sometimes it takes someone who's been hurt themselves to see that truth." The story could have ended there, but it didn't. Over the next few weeks, something remarkable happened. Tom did quit his waiter job, but not because he was fired. With Post's encouragement and support, he enrolled in counseling courses at the local college. His experiences, both giving and receiving judgment, had shown him his true calling. 1 month after that night, Tom stood in front of a group of new restaurant employees, sharing his story. He wasn't wearing his perfect uniform anymore. Instead, he wore regular clothes, his posture relaxed, his smile genuine. "I thought perfection meant never showing weakness," he told them. "But real strength? Real strength is being exactly who you are and helping others do the same." Post kept in touch, mentoring Tom through his career change. Their unlikely friendship became a symbol of something larger: the power of choosing understanding over anger, growth over revenge. The final piece fell into place when Tom received his first paycheck as a counselor. He used it to get his first tattoo, a small reminder on his wrist that simply read, "Judge less, love more." And every time he looked at it, he remembered the night when one person's kindness changed everything. Not because of who they were, but because of who they chose to be when faced with cruelty. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. Sometimes the deepest hurts can lead to the greatest healing. And sometimes the most powerful ending isn't about getting even, it's about getting better, together. The story spread, as stories do in the digital age. Not through official press releases or carefully crafted statements, but through the people who were there that night. Mike's videos of Post's charitable works went viral, alongside first-hand accounts of how he'd handled Tom's discrimination. But what caught people's attention wasn't the celebrity angle, it was the humanity of it all. "I was there," one diner wrote in a widely shared post. "And what I witnessed wasn't about fame or money. It was about two people finding understanding in the most unexpected place." The Grand Plaza Hotel's restaurant became a case study in corporate training programs across the country. Mrs. Chen was promoted to Regional Director of Hospitality Training, using her experience to help other establishments rethink their approach to service and inclusion. Mike, the young busboy who'd helped bring the truth to light, received a full scholarship to hotel management school, anonymously, though everyone suspected who was behind it. But the most profound change was in Tom himself. His journey from judgmental waiter to counselor in training became a story he shared openly, using his own transformation to help others recognize and overcome their biases. "The hardest part," he told his first therapy group, "was admitting that my perfectionism, my judgment of others, it was all just armor, protection against my own fears of not being good enough." Post kept his promise to stay in touch. He'd text Tom random encouragement, share stories from the road, ask about his studies. Their unlikely friendship puzzled many, but to them, it made perfect sense. "He saw past my worst moment," Tom explained in a graduation speech at his counseling program. "Not just to who I could be, but to why I was who I was." That's what real counseling is about, seeing past the surface to the pain underneath. The tattoo parlor, where Tom got his "Judge less, love more" inscription became a symbol of its own. The artist, initially surprised by the straight-laced former waiter's request, ended up hearing the whole story. "Never judge a book by its cover," she said, wiping the finished piece. "Or a person by their lack of tattoos, huh?" Tom laughed. "Or by their abundance of them." The corporate changes rippled outward. The Grand Plaza's new training program, Beyond Appearance, the Heart of Hospitality, became standard across their properties. Tom was often invited to speak, sharing his story alongside lessons about unconscious bias and authentic service. 1 year after that fateful night, Post was back in town for a show. He made a point to have dinner at the Grand Plaza, this time in a hoodie and sweatpants. The new staff, trained under the revised protocols, treated him with the same warmth and respect they showed every guest. After dinner, he and Tom met in that same private dining room where they'd had their first real conversation. The space felt different now, warmer, more welcoming. "Wild year," Post said, settling into a chair. Tom nodded, absently touching the tattoo on his wrist. "Thank you, again, for everything." "Nah, man, you did the hard part. Looking at yourself, making changes, that takes guts." Still, Tom paused, gathering his thoughts. "My father called last week. First time in months. He saw the video of my graduation speech." "Yeah? How'd that go?" "He cried," Tom said quietly. "Said he was sorry for teaching me that perfection was the only way to belong. We're going to try family counseling." Post smiled. "Look at you, breaking cycles all over the place." "That's what healing is, isn't it? Breaking cycles, choosing something better." They talked late into the night. Two unlikely friends bound by a moment that could have ended in bitterness, but instead sparked transformation. The next evening, at his sold-out show, Post dedicated a song to a friend who reminded me that everyone deserves a second chance at being who they really are. Tom, watching from the VIP section, his first concert ever, felt the words wash over him. His perfect waiter's posture was long gone, replaced by something more genuine. His upside-down name tag was framed on his office wall now, a reminder of the night everything changed. The story could have been about revenge, about public shaming, viral outrage, justified retaliation. Instead, it became something else, a testament to the power of seeing beyond surfaces, of choosing understanding over anger, of recognizing that sometimes the people who judge others most harshly are fighting their own battles. And in the end, that's what made it extraordinary. Not because it involved a celebrity, but because it reminded everyone who heard it that change is possible, that growth can come from the darkest moments, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is look past someone's worst behavior to see their potential for transformation. As Post would later write in the foreword to Tom's book about the experience, "Life's too short to hold on to hate. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is offer understanding to someone who didn't offer it to you. Because in the end, we're all just trying to find our way, trying to belong, trying to become who we really are." Tom kept the wine-stained shirt, carefully preserved in his office, not as a reminder of shame, but as a symbol of transformation. Next to it hung a simple frame containing a quote that Post had written to him: "Your worst moment doesn't define you. Your response to it does." And that, perhaps, was the most powerful lesson of all.